I'm very pleased to introduce Dargan Frierson.
Yeah,
Frierson, okay, from the University of Washington. And Dargan is on sabbatical, as he was already mentioning here in the room, to CMCC in Bologna until February.
Yeah.
And Dargan is an expert on latent heat and the connection between moisture and the general circulation, especially in the tropics. And he earned PhD degree from Princeton, which is a great achievement. Congratulations! And now he's associate professor at the University of Washington. So today we'll talk to us about past, present, future imperfect, carbon cycle biases in reduced complexity planning. And yeah, I won't keep it longer. I will give you the floor and please go ahead.
Thanks so much. Yeah. Apologies again for being late here. Yeah, but I'm super excited to talk with y'all today. You can see my title is I've been thinking about Italiano, right? Different tenses, right? Perfetto, imperfect, right? So this is maybe because I got language on my mind a little bit too much. Il mio italiano è molto mediocre. Yeah, thanks so much to Valeria for inviting me here. I followed Valeria's work for quite a while on energy transports and things like that. Even just recently was looking at the routine you'd submitted to the ESM VAL tool thing, which lets you download climate model data and then do analysis from there. So that was a really cool community contribution that he had made that I looked at recently. So anyway, yeah, let's see here. What I'm going to talk about in part is some of this recent research that I've done about very simple models that are used to go from emissions of carbon dioxide to global temperatures, right? But first, I want to give y'all a little bit more of my research history, because hopefully there'll be some collaboration possibilities and stuff like that. Essentially, some people now are like, why are you studying carbon cycle models? And I'm not a carbon cycle scientist, right? But I am a mathematician who's motivated mostly by climate, right? Who, I want to know what's going to happen. How can we give the best information about global warming, basically? And I started doing that with simplified models, then went to more comprehensive, and now I'm kind of back to simple models. Yeah, specifically, it's this model called FAIR that I'm going to be talking about a lot. And again, it's used to say whether, we'll go above 1.5 C global warming, or will a given emissions pathway take you over 2 degrees Celsius warming? And I kind of didn't realize this before getting into the work, but that is not done with Earth system models. It's done with these very simple emulators of Earth system models. And there's not too much study of these types of models. So yeah, so I'm going to talk about discovering some biases in this, and then some uses of FAIR for what we call climate accountability research. So essentially trying to figure out which fossil fuel company caused X percentage of the warming. And then potentially they could be found liable for that and be, held accountable for it, basically. Yeah, so my advisor was Isaac. Oh, no, sorry, Isac held. And this was my PhD project, was to develop a simplified general circulation model that had moisture in it, right? So Valerio mentioned latent heat release, right? So this is the precipitation that the model gives, but otherwise very simple. So completely ocean-covered planet, aqua planet. Gray radiative transfer, which means water vapor doesn't affect radiation. Okay. And latent heat release, simplified convection. And basically the goal of this was to have something where we could change the latent heat release within the atmosphere over very wide range. Roughly with 3 degrees of global warming, we expect around 7% per degree increase in moisture content. So that would be about a 20% increase in water vapor, right? But this is a model where we can change that. And I just wanted to show one little example from this model. This is kind of ancient history, but simple models are sometimes useful for a longer period of time, maybe. What's shown here is the northward transport of moisture in 3 simulations that we did with this model. So there is we ran this model completely dry, so you can turn off the release of latent heat completely, and the model runs without any moisture in the atmosphere. So obviously the poleward transport in blue there is 0. And then in the control case, it's sort of similar to the Earth today. You can see there's poleward transport within the mid-latitudes, right? And then equatorward transport within the Hadley cell. Okay, so that's the ITCZ bringing moisture towards Hadley circulation, and ITCZ bringing moisture towards the equator. And as we increase the moisture content of the air, then the model transports more of it, not surprisingly. It doesn't scale just with the moisture content. So how about the total energy transport? The total energy transport in the atmosphere is that moisture, the latent component, plus a dry component, right? Just transport of dry static energy or potential temperature poleward, right? In this model, if you look at that, it is essentially no change whatsoever in that. Let me see here. Let me see if I can. Hopefully, won't mess this up. There we go. And I also might try to get a pointer so that people can tell what I'm pointing at online. Oh, did I do the wrong one? Keep on, sorry. Solo io. I know that one.
Who can write notes? Only me or everyone? So let's just.
How do you say? Neanche io.
No, neither you.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah. Anyway, there's no change whatsoever in the total transport of energy. So somehow the dry energy transport reduces to almost exactly compensate for the increase in latent energy content. So as there's more energy transported poleward by moisture, right, evaporation within the subtropics, condensation at higher latitudes, that weakens the temperature gradients, right, weakens the eddies, and therefore leaves the total energy transport almost identical. To me, this sort of suggests that we can maybe do it within Zoom. Is it possible within Teams?
Now it's taking notes, and then I have no control of the.
Sorry. More mistakes here.
Oh yeah.
All right.
No, it's let's first do this. Why?
It's like,
okay, sorry. I don't know.
No, it's all good. This is just fine. Yeah. Yeah. It's just a research, right? I kind of tell my graduate students that sometimes, it's just research. If your model completely blows up, it's okay. If your talk, everything messes up, it's okay. It's not a big deal. We're here. This is fun. Okay. So yeah, there's about a 10% increase, but this sort of suggests that there's something, if you're trying to study those individually, it's probably better to look at them together rather than study one and then the other one. So anyway, what we ended up doing, here is that decrease in dry. static energy flux. And the the dry static energy flux essentially increases as the moisture content decreases, and the red case, which is a very high moisture case, right, has hardly any transport of dry static energy in the extratropics, and then has this really big transport in the tropics. So that's the result. And I wanted to say just that we then developed some energy balance models as simple ways to study that total energy transport, the moist static energy transport. So the sum of, this is kind of like an equivalent potential temperature. It's the sum of the latent component and the dry component, right? And essentially these models, they postulate diffusive transport, right? So this is like the Bedico-Sellers energy balance model, except they involve moisture as well as dry static energy. And just doing simple modeling of that, we were able to study mid-latitude energy transports. Arctic amplification, we showed that models that have more Arctic amplification actually have less transport of energy through the atmosphere into the Arctic. And that's because flux is proportional to the gradient, right? It's there's a decrease because it's not pausing the amplification, it's responding to the amplification. All this sort of suggests that atmospheric energy transports are not that difficult, right? That maybe we can form theories based on that, where sort of everything else has to follow from it. We also studied the ITCZ impact of this. So this is just one example of this, where we claim that the atmosphere responds to ocean energy transport via the AMOC, right? The polar transport of energy in the Atlantic Ocean that warms the northern hemisphere more than the southern hemisphere. Then the energy transports respond, so to spread that through the mid-latitudes all the way into the tropics, it can be understood with an energy balance model. And that when we take that out, even just in the extratropics, the signal from the AMOC spreads into the lower latitudes and gives you a maximum of precipitation that's then south of the equator. So the claim is that the ITCZ is in the northern hemisphere because of the AMOC, even though that's just expressed in the extratropics, because the fluxes of energy are diffusive and move it back towards the equator. So those are just a couple of results there. This specific project about the FAIR model is actually inspired by my teaching. And just before COVID started, in February 2020, I agreed to teach a new course on climate solutions. And I probably wouldn't have done it if I had known what was coming, but ended up working on this quite a bit, and we have a free textbook about it. A lot of it is interactive, so there are little simulation toy things in there. There's also interactive plots and things like that. So, and it's about climate solutions, but kind of trying to do it from a justice perspective, from climate justice perspective. It's tried not to make it be my vision of climate justice, but rather about, climate justice groups, what they've said about what is climate justice. And then specifically thinking about, can we model those futures, right? So we have little energy models, little climate models, right? And FAIR is a great example of a model that's actually used in practice to get that temperature change from emissions. I see this as like democratizing access to these tools, right? So trying to make it where anybody can, there's a low bar for entry here, so anybody can do this kind of modeling. It doesn't have to be just huge groups of scientists, right? Can we help others to envision their own futures But to start, I'm going to talk about how the scenarios and temperature forecasts are made for the IPCC, because this is another one that I didn't really realize before going in there. So the IPCC process for modeling, right, is to start with energy, agriculture, etc. choices, right? Certainly includes like a carbon price to reduce emissions more in some scenarios. And then that's put into an integrated assessment model, YAM, which calculates the emissions from that, all right? And then those emissions are given to a climate model, right? Got to have emissions of everything. So carbon dioxide, methane, all of the air pollutants, sulfates, NOx, carbon monoxide, right? There's a very long list of substances. And then it's given to a model to calculate the temperature. But as I was saying earlier, it's not actually ESMs that are used to make that final decision. It's rather reduced complexity models. It's the name that they call these, right? I'm not too into this name because it's like reduced compared to what, right? Like it's always relative, right? So, but that's what they call them, and FAIR is an example of this. We did little, just super simple calculations of like how much electricity does it take to run the world off of all electric vehicles, all electric industry, just using some simple formulas. And these are tools online that you can check out. You know, we've checked these out with energy folks. You know, I'm currently working some just as a very side project, working with the post-growth modeling community, who's trying to set up different ways of reaching, you know, no fossil fuel emissions for the future. So yeah, that's just our little attempt to do a little bit of the energy modeling side of things, right? The talk from now on, though, is going to be about the emissions to temperature part, right? So assuming that we have all of those CO2 emissions, methane, sulfates, how do you get temperature? And I think it's useful to start to just do a simple example with one of these models, okay? So as a simple example, what we're going to assume is that all emissions stop today of everything, okay? All anthropogenic emissions. So fossil fuels, methane, air pollution, right? And what happens in that case? Y'all feel free to ask questions if you have any, all right? Yeah. The first thing that happens is that air pollution disappears. Right? I remember this in Seattle, even in the beginning of COVID, you know, when no traffic on the roads. We live near the highway, it was quiet, you know, no noise pollution, right? That doesn't go into the climate models, but then the air pollution cleans up, right? And that would be fantastic for human health, right? A lot of people live shorter lives because of air pollution, especially in places like Delhi, which is pictured here. But there's also a climate effect of that, right? That haze reflects back sunlight. So in response to that, in these models, you get an immediate jump up of temperature, okay? This is the observed temperature, right? And as simulated by this model FAIR, right? It's tuned to give the observational temperature change very well, right? But these are probability FAIRs run with a very large ensemble, 1,000 members or so, right? So these are confidence intervals. And you can see that immediately the temperature jumps up, right? That's due to the aerosol effect, aerosol decrease. And also the spread increases, because this is a part of climate science that's very uncertain, right? We don't know how much the current radiative forcing is. Okay, so that's that part. The next part is that methane decreases, right? And that very quickly goes below any recent methane concentration, right? So you can see here is plotted the 1960 through 2020, in this case, concentration. And even within 10 years or so, the concentrations are below what they were in the 1960s, right? Methane has about a decade time scale, right? So rate of forcing from that decreases quite a bit too. So in response to that, after this big upswing, there's a decrease, right? There's still a lot of scientific uncertainty given by this model in this situation, right? I think it's important to recognize the parts of global warming that are reversible, right? So sea ice presumably would follow the global temperatures, right? The hydrologic cycle, the atmospheric moisture content, right, would follow the global temperature presumably, though those aren't simulated in this model, right? So then finally, carbon dioxide, though, sticks around a really long time, right? So even with no fossil fuel emissions, the concentration of CO2 after emissions stop, even in 2080, it's only around year 2000 values, right? So CO2 has very persistent time scales, right? It doesn't just dissipate in the atmosphere, it interacts with other parts of the carbon cycle, some of which have very, very long time scales. So essentially the temperatures stay warm in this situation, right? So this is why we have to prepare for climate impacts no matter what mitigation choices are, right? Carbon dioxide kind of has 4 time scales. So forgive me if I'm doing like 101 sort of stuff, but that's where I started with the carbon cycle like 2 years ago, right? The carbon dioxide, it has a very fast uptake into the surface ocean. So there's year time scales for that, few years. The terrestrial biosphere, right? The vegetation, the soils, right? Take up carbon dioxide over decades. The deep ocean, right? Ocean takes a really long time to overturn, right? Many, many decades to centuries, couple hundred years, right? So that's another time scale. And then some essentially doesn't go away because it interacts with the solid earth, right? There's chemical weathering that takes hundreds of thousands to millions of year time scales. So I'm getting into the model part, right? Here, as you'll see in a second, this model FAIR essentially uses those 4 time scales in its modeling. So here's another thing that was surprising to me. These ESMs simulate the carbon cycle, but they're not used in scenarios. Scenario MIP, right? You know, familiar with this set of runs for CMIP, right? Those run in concentration mode. Yeah, yeah, so far, yeah. But even for CMIP 7, they're mostly planned to do that. There are a few exceptions, right? Like one of them is the SSP 585 is also run in Earth system mode, right? I think that we should run a lot more fully coupled, you know, carbon cycle runs. Yeah. Oh, no kidding.
Well, you would be still allowed to run in the concentration mode.
Okay.
But it's highly encouraged to just to stick to the.
Okay, that's really good news. So cool. That's excellent to hear. Yeah. Just right. Yeah. So the comment was that in CMIP 7, it's looking like a lot of people will run, a lot of groups will run in emissions mode, which is really good news, I think, you know. Yeah, because basically these concentrations for CMIP 6, for CMIP 5, for CMIP 3, right? Those were determined by these reduced complexity models. Specifically, it's this one called Magic C that is really simple, incredibly simple. It just has northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere. That's its resolution is, 10,000 kilometer, right? Not exactly our high res, and very, very simple parameterizations of like a diffusive ocean, really, really simple parameterizations of land surfaces and stuff, right? So I don't think we're getting the real uncertainty there without running it within the full model. The idea, though, is that these reduced complexity models, you could run them with ranges of uncertain parameters, right? That can span a large space, maybe, that can represent a lot of uncertainty, right? But what I'm going to show is an example where it's not working, okay? Where the carbon cycle model gives a very small range of potential CO2 concentrations in response to an emissions scenario. This is a little schematic that shows, like in this Magic C, there's 3 land carbon pools. This green and brown is supposed to represent the land, right? So there's like, woody biomass, right? Living biomass, detritus, and soil carbon, right? Just one of these for the whole globe, right? There's this Swan-Deutsch model that those are some UW scientists. They put in 3 continents. Pretty good, right? Pretty high res. This one, Hector, is this one. And then, as you'll see in a second, FAIR doesn't even really distinguish between land and ocean and those things. This is the blue parts representing the ocean. So this is a vertical upwelling diffusion model, basically. This one has a little like thermohaline circulation, right? So that's like Southern Ocean carbon, and et cetera, et cetera. I've got a few different data points there, right? But all of these are essentially like globally averaged or just a little bit more points, right? So I think we really need to study, these models better. Sorry, that's my little land ocean. Yeah. So FAIR, Chris Smith, fantastic model. I love this model, even though like we're criticizing it, right? This work was allowed by the fact that the code is incredibly clearly written. It's all public, right? They have little Jupyter notebooks where you can just get started right away, right? I've never encountered another climate model that's so easy to use, right? It's also pretty easy to understand. It's globally averaged. It just has 3 modes for temperature, and it has 4 timescales for the carbon cycle, which are those 4 that I talked about before, kind of like a surface ocean, land, deep ocean, solid Earth. All right. Magic C only has 2 hemispheres, right? Not much scrutiny of these models. So if you run FAIR and compare it, this is its very newest configuration, 1.4.1 it's called. If you run that with the same emissions and compare it with the concentrations from the official SSP, it's lower in all cases, right? So these are those, this is FAIR's ensemble, right? In the spread there, each of these are different SSP scenarios, right? Pretty significantly lower, like essentially immediately, right? And that ensemble spread, is really small in some of them and completely outside of the Magic C, given one. Maybe the other one's wrong, right? We don't know that at this point, right? This is another reduced complexity model, but I'm going to study some of the reasons why we think that CO2 is what it is in this model and why there's such a small range. This is the difference plot, right? So you can see it also undershoots compared with the historical record, and that future CO2 concentration becomes smaller really quickly, right? So FAIR's carbon cycle is based on this AR5 IR impulse response model, okay? And essentially it's just 4 time scales, okay? So if you have a pulse of CO2, T, right? The concentration that results from that pulse is the sum of 3 exponentials and a constant term, okay? So it basically partitions the pulse into 4 different pools, they call them, okay? Infinity timescale, that represents the solid Earth. Deep ocean, 400-year timescale. Land, 40-year timescale. And surface ocean, 4-year timescale. This is tuned to simulations with Earth system models and EMICs, like intermediate complexity models, from this Yos et al. 2013 study, basically. So they found that models pretty well are represented by those 4 time scales if you do a pulse of emissions. Those were derived from 2010 background conditions. Okay, so you would expect it to be different if you did this at different, historical eras or whatever, right? But that's this AR5IR one, okay, based on the Yos et al. FAIR adds a parameter alpha. So can you see this? Instead of just T over tau, right? It's T over alpha tau, okay? So what they do here is they calculate one new parameter that represents carbon cycle feedbacks. And they modify all the time scales by that, okay? So instead of like 440, 400, and infinity, if alpha were 0.1, it would be 0.44, 40, and also infinity still, right? It's actually critical that the solid Earth one, that infinity one, doesn't ever change, right? In response to an alpha change. And they make this proportional to temperature, essentially, like it's an exponential of something proportional to temperature, carbon concentration, CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, and accumulated carbon in sinks. And these are also calibrated to Earth system models, okay? So let's see what happens with this. This is if you run FAIR against those exact models that were run to calibrate that. It's that Yos et al. 2013 study, okay? These are each of the models, and these are 2 calibrations of FAIR in blue and red. So you can see that it does not match the models that it was tuned to, right? Even when it run exactly the same conditions as that, right? So something's going on there, right? This is suggesting that FAIR dissipates CO2 much too quickly and that there's way too little variance as well, right? This needs to be way more variance. And it's worse in the 1.41 as compared to the 1.40, okay? What are the lifetimes? This is that alpha parameter, right? Should be 1 in 2010 in order to have the timescales be right? But it's not anywhere close to 1, right? It's around 0.3, 0.35, right? Even into the future, it gets still way, way too small. So that's why it dissipates too fast. Okay. Here it is as compared to some newer climate models, the same I thing. So you can see that, carbon cycle models have evolved since that Yos et al. Study, right? Those were kind of, a lot of the carbon cycle scientists would say not all those models were very good, right? But here's the newest range from CNIP 6, examining this same parameter over the historical period. And you can see also that it's just not much spread. Maybe now there's one model that's less, BCC model, but then there's, not nearly enough spread being captured by FAIR in either case. So why is this? It does the past perfect, right? Past is perfect by definition, right? They set up the tuning so that only ensemble members that give the right CO2 concentration pass the test, right? So these are right. It's right, you know. But then if you look at the breakdown into the different pools, you can't quite see this, but the infinity one essentially has almost all the carbon. Okay. So that's the one that has no uncertainty whatsoever, right? It's not affected by alpha because the time scale does not modify it, right? It's basically just 0.23 times the total CO2 emissions is the amount of carbon dioxide in that. Most of it's in there. So imagine a situation in which historical emissions are revised upward, okay? That's actually the difference between the 1.40 and the 1.41. They put more, they recognized that historical emissions were larger. Well, let me wait a second to say that, okay? You can see that the short time scale ones hardly hold anything, right? Very little. These other two, the 400-year pool, deep ocean pool, the land, one that interacts with the land, both of these have, you know, non-negligible, but still less than the infinity. So the infinity pool, they call these infinity pools. I Googled infinity pool Italy, infinity pool Italia, and that's what it gave. So not that kind of infinity pool. The yeah. Although that looks pretty nice, right? Yeah. So this equation is just strictly determined by emissions, period. It's not a function of any climate parameter in this model, right? 21% put in there, right? A critical thing here is that we don't actually know what historical emissions were, right? There's uncertainty, especially in the land use emissions historically, right? However, this gives it just one time series, right? So it means that there's no uncertainty in that, right? That gives very little leeway for other uncertainties to happen. Essentially, what I'm going to argue is that if most of it goes into this, then no matter how much you change your carbon cycle parameters, it's just not able to change these much, right? And if they get, you know, if there's a requirement to make them smaller, it has to come out of all of these, right? That actually causes it to have very, very short time scales. Yeah, and we know that this assumption of the constant concentration is not even right. Even in those original Yost simulations, they showed that a pre-industrial atmosphere takes up more carbon dioxide, doesn't leave as much in for forever, right? Less full infinity pool. This is the emissions revision that characterizes the difference between the 1.4.1 tuning and the 1.4.0 tuning. So we evidently, they figured out from the Global Carbon Project, right, that actually the land use emissions were higher in the, you know, 1850 to 1950, 1960 period. And then these have been revised down a little bit. These have been revised up. But cumulative emissions in the newest global carbon budget are larger than they were in the SSPs. So give all this extra emissions to the carbon cycle to fare, right? It's got to shorten the time scale a lot, right? It's got to bring, if this one is going up, these got to go way down, right? And it can only do that with very short time scales, basically. Yeah. How does FAIR deal with larger emissions, right? It says basically that we know CO2 concentrations really accurately in 1850, 1750, especially today, no uncertainty, right? Historical emissions are put in as known. That's probably a mistake, right? But it's also hard it's hard to know what else to do, you know? Yeah, very little room for different alpha values. when an emissions increase happens. When emissions are larger, timescales have to shorten a lot. And basically that even gives a quantitative explanation. We're able to figure this out quantitatively too, that you can only allow solutions with smaller alpha if you have this kind of upward revision of emissions. So yeah, that's this. I can definitely get into more details about like that, but I think that gives the gist of this explanation. So yeah, pretty fascinating to us to find this out, and we're working with Chris Smith and other folks to hopefully fix this in future versions of FAIR. Definitely not trying to say that Magic C is believable, right? All these simple models deserve a lot of scrutiny, I think, and the hope would be that we'd run these with Earth system models soon in the future anyway. Yeah, other uses of FAIR, this is actually why I got into this, is feeling a little bit hopeless about climate policy in the United States, right? And wanting to do something still, right? And that's something, at least seems to me to be valuable to say, no matter what emissions happens, we know who did that, and we know the amount of global warming it's causing, right? And maybe someday somebody will be held accountable for that, right? So that was the idea, so we picked up FAIR to do this. What year was this? I like to do this little quiz. General scientific agreement that the most likely manner in which mankind is influencing global climate is through the burning of fossil fuels, right? That's Dr. James Black, who's a climate scientist employed by Exxon. He said that to the board in 1977, right? Which is largely before global warming happened, right? In 1977, that was temperatures to that point, right? And since then, they've gone up like this, right? So we've known about this for a long time. Exxon, even that guy Black and other folks did research on climate. They projected this kind of temperature change, and the observed is right in the middle of what they found. That was very consistent with university and government scientists as well. So these predictions came true. In the 1980s, Exxon stopped doing climate modeling and switched a lot of funding to climate denial research, right? Going after even individual scientists and trying to pick holes in arguments, not in a constructive way, but in a way to make people think there was more uncertainty about climate than there actually was. Climate pollution, right? See, fossil fuel burning, more than half has happened since 1977. So could imagine a very different world here, right? So we put this stuff into FAIR. There's this great data set called Carbon Majors that calculates how much fossil fuel emissions were from companies like Exxon or other, so it's the black line there, right? Which is almost as high as the blue historical, but not the entire thing, right? And then we compare with a counterfactual, which is no emissions from carbon majors, okay? And that's the dashed blue line there. And essentially, we're just studying a little problem, which is how does the warming attributable to fossil fuel companies from the historical record, just through today, right? How does that differ under a high emissions future, a medium emissions future, and a low emissions future? Okay, so that's the problem we're setting out, and we found essentially that the temperature change is about the same. It's kind of remarkable, right? FAIR, you can really easily run up to 2,500, and there's not that much sensitivity to the background emission scenario. That, what you can see that the, high is actually a little bit less warming than this one. This is due to the carbon majors, right? So it's when you take out those historical emissions, right? The high emissions still warms a lot more, right? But the difference due to that historical emissions is 0.4 C, right? Even out to 2,500, right? And it's about that in all cases, maybe a little bit higher in the lower emissions cases. And we found that the CO2 change was larger in the higher emission scenarios than in the low emission scenarios, right? So the carbon cycle feedbacks are stronger in the high and medium cases, right? Smaller in the low cases. But then the radiative forcing change, since that's logarithmic in carbon dioxide concentration, right? You get more radiative forcing change in the lower emissions. So if your background CO2 is smaller, a perturbation of CO2 gives less of a radiative forcing change. It's essentially those two things that balance out that give you a similar amount of warming in all cases. So anyway, just one thing to think about there. Yeah, simple models, love them, can be really useful for understanding more complex model results. We got to be careful when tuning these, of course, and hopefully this is, the one direction of use of those models that'll be useful in practice sometime in the future. So thank you all for listening. Appreciate it. Yeah.
Things.
No.
Yeah, I think we have time for a few questions. I will start from the people in the room, and then let's see if someone from the remote audience has some questions as well. Exactly.
Yeah.
So now, this clarification might have got me confused, but in the slide with the different time scales, and you were saying,
Yeah.
is that the message that the in fact most of the CO2 goes into the land, into the earth, the rocks?
So this is a little bit strange, right? So what they do is they partition emissions into 4 different pools, right? The real world does not work like this at all, right? But they basically say that 25% of it only has a chance to interact with the solid earth and therefore has no uptake, okay? So it's like in the atmosphere, but it's only allowed to interact with the solid earth and there's no uptake. So I think I say that wrong a lot, when I'm referring to these, but that means that it only has the possibility of uptake by this. Yeah. So then this one only interacts, this, 27% only interacts with the surface ocean and therefore gets taken up immediately, essentially. And then it has almost nothing in the atmosphere because it's taken up by the sources, the sink there. Yeah. Yep. Thanks for. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, but I think you can see, there's a lot to object to about that formulation, right? It makes a lot more sense, I think, to have actual pools that can interact with each other, right? And that is what the models like Hector and Magic C do, right? But with FAIR, at least we know what's going on with it, Magic C is not open source. So it's possible to run it online, but it's not possible to see the code, which for me was really critical in getting into this stuff. Hector is another model that's really, really great, open, yeah, but Magic C is kind of the standard one that's used. Yeah.
More questions?
Yeah.
And when you show these plots where you conclude that the CO2 is underestimated.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah,
I guess that if you compare these, yes,
yeah,
different scenarios, then you run fair for a few years. So you are there considering only the two faster timescales of carbon emissions.
yeah.
So that underestimation comes from those timescales.
Mm. That's a great point, I think. Yeah. So this is a, especially in the historical record, right? There's not any chance to validate a 400-year time scale, and certainly not an infinity one, right? These are kind of the only ones that you can do, right? Now, I think the Yost et al. Paper would say, well, we ran some of our models for longer periods of time and et cetera, right? So that at least this tuning is done with that. But even if you go back to it, not many of the Earth system models were run for very long time. So I think, it very much should be thought of as uncertain parameters, right? In fair, none of these fractions are changed with climate state. I think it would be better to set up fair in a way where that partitioning could change rather than the timescale for everything together, because these aren't very determined. Yeah. Did that answer? I don't know if that answered quite well enough. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a great point. Yeah.
I was wondering how sensitive is the model to, I mean, I understand that the time scales are given,
Yeah.
but I was wondering how sensitive is the model to and sensitive that has to be on the time scales if it was checked, stuff like that.
Yeah, right. So let me so basically what they do is they have this I this I thing that's kind of like, it's parameterized exponentially based on the sum of these, okay? And it basically is like an airborne fraction over 100 years, over the following 100 years is what it is. Like expressed in percent, okay? So this basically means it starts around 30% airborne fraction and then goes up to around 40%, right? So I think you can see also that there's a large uncertainty initially in this, but somehow it all gets winnowed down, to just a very small amount of uncertainty at the time where it matters, when most of the emissions were around, right? So it's trying to allow there to be, different pre-industrial things when T is zero, when the carbon perturbations are zero. It's trying to have an uncertainty there, but then it ends up being that the only ones that satisfy the, the cut, right, of the ones that agree with the current CO2 amount.
Starts with the tuning.
Exactly. Yeah. You cut any chance of there being any uncertainty in this whatsoever around year 2000 or so. So, yeah. Right. Yeah. So I don't know. What do you do about that? Right. I think we kind of need a new way of thinking about this.
Longer simulation.
Yeah. That's true, right? That's true. Yeah. I think number one is more emissions forced ESM simulations, right? There's starting to be more and more of these. There's one called ZEC-MIP. ZEC is the zero emissions commitment, right? So that says, what if we just stopped emission, like the example that I gave, right? What if we stopped emissions today? What would the temperature change be? These are super useful for understanding. They do emissions forced by necessity, right? Yeah.
But there's also long run MIP, I think.
Yeah, long run MIP. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Long this year.
Yeah.
And for 500 years.
Yep.
I think somewhere.
Nice. Yeah. 1,000 years. Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
They were extended. Okay. More questions in the room? Questions from the, alle.
Yeah.
It's slightly shifting the discussion.
Sure.
At some point, you were mentioning post-growth.
Yeah.
Sort of side project.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, I mean, my understanding is this sort of the post-growth storyline in a way. It's
Yeah.
not mainstream at
Yeah.
the moment in the wider
Right.
community of integrated assessment modeling. I was talking to some colleagues who are more into the EAMS modeling people, and they were saying that there was a kind of shift, recent shift in the mindset of the people, that it used to be very non-mainstream and very niche.
Yeah.
And just a minority of people were seriously considering post-growth. Like, what is your feeling about it?
Yeah.
People is changing their mindset about
it. Right. So,
I
I think it's true. Yeah. And I think like essentially the IAMs are mostly determined by carbon pricing, right? That's their method to get emissions down, right? Is carbon pricing. Carbon pricing is not going so well, right? And it's also, I think, becoming clear that it is possible to have big government programs that reduce CO2, like Green New Deal is the way we describe that in the US, right? We have no Green New Deal, right? But the Green Deal in Europe, right, I think is a great example of this. And China, massively state supported, y'all can tell me about whether that's any good, but, there is a lot of government effort to decarbonize. And I think, a purely rational actor, economic, dependence where pricing determines everything, where we all maximally consume and that makes us happier, that's not the only way to look at the world, right? So I like to think about it at least as let's broaden the space here, right? The IAMs also go completely to bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, right? I think that's reason enough to, we need a totally new vision here, right? Because bioenergy with carbon capture and storage is not happening. They predict that, in some cases, like 6 times the amount of irrigated land used today is going to biofuels that are burned, make all sorts of air pollution, and then you pipe the smoke underground, right? So, there's a lot of futures that are possible. So like that's my hope, is just that we can simulate more with these, and the post-growth community is tiny still, I think, but like I was on a meeting with them just the other night, and it's strong in Europe, so it's easy to hook up here. Back in the US, I had to get up at like 2 a.m. for meetings, to talk. But yeah, there are folks, even here in Italy, like Pisa and Vienna, Barcelona, right? Leeds, those are all places that have really strong post-growth stuff. Yeah. Thank you all for listening.
I don't know if there are questions from the Moodle audience. Otherwise, I would say a big thank you to Dargan for.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for your patience. Yeah.